Virtual reality applications are diverse and can include exposure therapy for fear of heights, military training, pain management, and disaster management training. Virtual reality users are also diverse across age, physical ableness, race and ethnicity, and gender. The development and evaluation of VR applications for this diverse set of users often follows user-centered design practices. In the last 5 years of papers published at IEEE VR, 82% of the manuscripts reported results from human subjects user studies. We are interested in investigating the population of users studied in IEEE VR manuscripts to determine if they are representative of the diverse set of potential virtual reality users across the globe. During this presentation, I will use the term gender, defined as the socially constructed expectations for behaviors, characteristics, and roles considered appropriate for women and men. This includes male, female, gender fluid, agender, and more. We discussed the demographics that were reported in manuscripts where all participants were identified as either male or female, except for one participant who was identified as transgender. During this presentation, the blue icon will represent male participants and the red icon will represent female participants. We collected data from the last 5 years of IEEE VR. This included 325 manuscripts that reported results on 429 studies. Collected data included the manuscript type, journal or conference, the number of participants, including the proportion of female participants, the average age of participants, and the number of authors, including the gender of the first author and the proportion of female authors. To limit data entry errors, each manuscript was checked by at least 2 people. When determining manuscript author gender, we performed internet searches, looked at LinkedIn accounts, and university websites. Previous research suggests that misclassification rates are approximately 0.3% when using internet searches to identify author gender. Additionally, the data can be downloaded from GitHub. The participant analysis was performed with the data from 319 out of the 429 total studies published at IEEE VR from 2015 through 2019. Studies were excluded due to not collecting data from human participants, not reporting the number of study participants, or not reporting gender demographics. The general population of the world is approximately 50% men and 50% women. An underrepresentation of women and girls in VR research would be evident by significantly fewer female participants compared to male participants. Each glyph represents 50 participants from user studies at IEEE VR over the last 5 years. During this time, there were 3,684 female participants and 5,873 male participants. The median number of male participants per study was 13, while the median number of female participants was significantly fewer at only 7. This supports our first hypothesis, that female participants are underrepresented in human subject VR research compared to male participants. We next investigated the hypothesis that female authors are underrepresented in VR research compared to male authors. The author analysis was performed with the data from 320 out of the 325 published manuscripts. Manuscripts were excluded if one author gender was not identifiable on the paper. 323 manuscripts were used in the first author analysis. During the last 5 years, only 16% of authors were women. This underrepresentation may be partially explained by the underrepresentation of women obtaining PhDs in computer science. However, virtual reality research is interdisciplinary and includes other disciplines like human-computer interaction or psychology, where women are not underrepresented. Not only are women underrepresented, but they are not part of the research. The median number of male authors per paper was 3, while the median number of female authors was 0. This means that fewer than 50% of papers had female authors involved in the research. This supports our second hypothesis, that female authors are underrepresented in VR research compared to male authors. This is troubling, since previous research has shown that diverse research teams are more innovative, creative, and productive compared to non-diverse research teams. We also considered the relationship between authors and participants. We hypothesized that there are a greater number of female participants in studies in papers with female authors compared to papers with exclusively male authors. We compared the proportion of female participants reported in papers with the number of female authors on the paper. For papers with no female authors, 34% of reported participants were female. However, when a paper included at least one female author, the proportion of female participants rose significantly to 41%. This supports our hypothesis that there is a greater number of female participants in studies published in manuscripts with female authors compared to participants in studies published in manuscripts whose authors are exclusively male. We further investigated if the underrepresentation of female participants were potentially biasing results in VR research. Let's assume that there are no VR measures related to the proportion of female participants in a study. If this is true, we can continue using participant samples with significantly fewer women and girls compared to men and boys. Let's consider the common measurement of simulator sickness. It is relevant for all VR experiences, and previous research has found gender differences in simulator sickness, but differences are not seen in all studies. Finally, there is a standard simulator sickness questionnaire, making it easier to compare results across studies. In human subjects design experiments, data is collected from participants and then an effect size, a quantitative measure of the magnitude of the experiment effect that emphasizes the size of the difference between two variables, is then calculated on that population. In a meta-analysis, instead of collecting data from individual participants, standardized effect sizes are collected from individual studies that meet predefined criteria. These effect sizes are then weighted and combined to produce an estimate of the average effect size across the set of studies. The studies included in our meta-analysis presented results of an empirical study of human subjects. The study participants were exposed to an immersive virtual environment using a head-mounted display. The study assessed simulator sickness before and after virtual reality exposure using the Kennedy Simulator Sickness Questionnaire. The manuscript reported data for the calculation of an effect size representing the average within participant change in simulator sickness. And the manuscript reported the number or proportion of female participants. 22 of the 429 studies met our predefined data criteria and were included in our meta-analysis. The results of our meta-regression can be seen in the following bubble plot. Each dot is a study that met our predefined criteria. The y-axis is the study level effect size, and the x-axis is the proportion of female participants included in the study. This is redundantly encoded with the color of the circle. The size of the circle is proportional to the precision of the effect size of each study. Precision encompasses variance, standard error, and confidence intervals, and is affected by both the sample size and study design. As the proportion of female participants increased, we observed smaller increases in simulator sickness following VR exposure. The overall effect size indicates that, on average, participants in VR studies using HMDs experience small but significant increases in simulator sickness after VR exposure. However, this outcome was systematically related to the proportion of female participants included in each study. This finding is surprising, as some studies have found evidence that women are more susceptible to motion sickness. However, it is important to note that the study-level findings of this meta-analysis do not necessarily indicate that individual female participants reported smaller changes in simulator sickness. We further investigated if any other moderators, including manuscript type, participant age, or first author gender, were significantly associated with the observed effect sizes of each study. The proportion of female participants was the only significant moderator. This demonstrates that our original assumption was false, since there is at least one VR study measure, simulator sickness, related to the proportion of female participants in a study. Further, our results provide evidence that continuing to collect data from participant populations where women and girls are underrepresented may result in biased findings. To limit biased findings when developing VR hardware and software for a general population, an equal proportion of male and female participants must be used. With data collected from the last 5 years of IEEE VR, we were able to support all 3 of our hypotheses. That female participants are underrepresented in human subject VR research compared to male participants. That female authors are underrepresented in VR research compared to male authors. And that there are a greater number of female participants in studies published in manuscripts with female authors compared to participants in studies published in manuscripts whose authors are exclusively male. We also demonstrated that the underrepresentation of women and girls as participants is biasing results by showing that there is at least one VR study measure related to the proportion of female participants in a study. This indicates that there may be more measures that we are unaware of. VR applications and users are diverse. If we are designing with the intention that everyone will use virtual reality, then we must test and design for all of our intended users. As researchers, we must commit to using samples that are representative of the population for which the technology is being designed. When we are developing for the general population, we must collect data from populations that are approximately 50% women and 50% men. As authors, we must include demographic information in our papers so that readers can accurately interpret the population that was studied. And finally, as reviewers, we must provide appropriate constructive criticism and advice when papers making general claims do not use a participant sample that is representative of the population. As a community, by committing to these simple changes, we can produce higher quality scholarship and develop virtual reality applications for everyone.